All right. Hello, everybody. Come in, come in, come in. It is good to see you, although we can't see you. We're just going to wait another minute or two for everybody to arrive and take their virtual seat. I hope everybody had a good Tuesday and sort of got through the beginning of a fairly different semester if you are at university and or have kids who go to school. Everything's kind of new this semester, and I hope everybody's well and okay. And we're just going to wait another minute or two for folks to arrive. What I always say at this point, and I just told our wonderful panelists that if we were at the Institute for Public Knowledge, the space, pun intended, then we would be grazing the buffet and having informal chats and connecting with people who maybe we haven't seen in a long while and kind of just hanging out a bit. So we're just gonna give it a little bit of time. Those of you who are watching over the stream on Twitter, hello, it's good to see you. If you have questions for our panelists, you can just pop them into the comment box under the stream, and our team will collect those and relay them to me, and I can ask these questions on your behalf towards the end of our session. Okay, we are gonna delve right in because we have changed our format a little bit, and we have shaved off a half hour. So we've got a good hour now with our panelists. So with that, I'm just going to formally open Co-opting AI Fall 2021 with our first session on space. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for coming back. Today, I'm hosting two fantastic scholars to talk about something that is kind of very deeply entangled with our imagination of what science, what technology, and what progress can be, and also what artificial intelligence can be. My name is Dr. Mona Sloane. I am a sociologist at New York University. I study the intersection of artificial intelligence and society. I do a little bit of work on policy as well. I am a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge, where I run the Co-opting AI series. I'm also a senior research scientist at NYU's Center for Responsible AI, and I also have the absolute pleasure of teaching young engineers at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Now, Co-opting AI, which has been going strong for almost 3 years now, would not be possible without the very generous support and sponsorship of the Institute for Public Knowledge, the 370J Project, the NYU Center for Responsible AI, and the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at Tandon. Thank you so much for your continued support of the series and for going strong with us into well over 25 sessions. Now, please allow me to frame the conversation a little bit. Space and claims to it, we could say, are always about power. So before we embark onto a conversation about what that means in the context of outer space and the organization of human space exploration, I want to acknowledge that I am standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you may be located, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also want to express my commitment to the ongoing project to tackle white privilege and systemic racism, and to develop an anti-racist culture in our communities and institutions, and the academy in particular. Now, space, the stars, the universe have always fueled our imagination and the production of knowledge, from philosophy to astronomy, science, religion, across cultures and centuries. As humans, we seem to look to the stars in one way or the other to try and figure out who we are. On a less philosophical or perhaps spiritual level, it is fair to say that space exploration has been a frontier of technology innovation, with artificial intelligence being no exception. Today, different AI applications are already playing a somewhat central role in space exploration, from satellite data processing to navigation systems to systems monitoring and maintenance. Artificial intelligence systems are increasingly embedded into the ways in which we do space exploration. At the same time, and this is an old story, space exploration and the race for technological innovation that is tied to it is an arena of geopolitical power struggles between nations and increasingly between private and public actors. At the recent UN 2021 Outer Space Security Conference, it became clear that there is an urgent need for international agreements that govern who can do what in outer space, especially against the backdrop of exploding commercial activity. Now, this commercial activity is chiefly driven by a few individuals who happen to have made fortunes building large tech companies and who are also monopolies of AI research and practice. As fears of a new arms race in space are brewing, but hopes rest yet again in some way on new technologies that can help with issues. For example, issues around regulating space traffic. And while we observe all that, we may want to be mindful that the world exploration can have strong imperialist connotations. So with today's Co-opting AI event, we want to examine how imaginaries of space and space exploration are not only entangled with technological innovation and AI in particular, but also what the social, political, and economic impacts are of said entanglement. And frankly, I cannot think of two better experts to steer this conversation than my guests tonight, Dr. Kimberly Mckinson and Dr. Janet Vertesi. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, starting us off will be Dr. Janet Vertesi, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology. And sorry, Janet, I gave you the wrong run of show earlier. We'll be starting off with you, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Princeton University, where she specializes in the sociology of science, knowledge, and technology. Her primary research sites, her primary research site actually is with NASA's robotic spacecraft teams as an ethnographer. Her book, Seeing Like Rover: Imagination and Interaction on the Mars Exploration Rover Mission, came out with Chicago in 2015, and she does have a new book out, 2020. Here it is, Shaping Science, Organizations, Decisions, and Culture on NASA's Team. Highly recommend. You can buy this book. This book draws on her ethnographic studies of missions to Mars, Saturn, and the outer planets to examine how organizations matter to scientific discovery. She's also a leader in digital sociology, whether studying computational systems and social life, shifting research methods online, or applying social insights to build technologies along different lines. She holds a master's degree from Cambridge and a PhD from Cornell. She also has received several grants from the NSF and has been awarded top prizes for her work from the ASA Science, Knowledge, and Technology section and Communication, Information Technology and Media section, and the Society for Social Studies of Science. Welcome, Janet. And before I hand it over to you, I'm also going to introduce Kimberly. Following Janet's remarks will be Dr. Kimberly Mckinson, who is a cultural anthropologist conducting ethnographic research in Jamaica. She received her PhD from the University of California at Irvine and is currently an assistant professor of anthropology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY. Her current book project examines the security and insecurity, memory, Black historiography, and post-coloniality in Jamaica. A second research project explores questions of space colonization, Blackness, and Caribbean Afrofuturism. Her work has also been supported by the National Science Foundation, the University of California Center for New Racial Studies, the University of California Collaboratory for Ethnographic Design, and CUNY. Please join me in welcoming our fantastic panel tonight. Janet, last words, I promise. Before we delve into the panel discussion in the Q&A session, please, you can keep sharing your screen. Don't worry about it. That actually is a nice backdrop. Our panelists will talk up to 10 minutes and give a short provocation and presentation of their work. Then we'll have a brief panel discussion, and then it's all over to our audience, who please bring their questions to us through the Q&A function in Zoom. And with that, I'm going to stop talking finally, and I just want to express my gratitude to our panelists tonight, and thank you so much. And over to you, Janet, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited about this conversation. I wanted to center my remarks about a juxtaposition between what I see about what we think about when we think about robots and artificial intelligence in space, and then what it's actually like to work with robots in space. And here I see a disjuncture where our narratives, our techno narratives that come from these broad science fiction imaginaries, are leading us astray to build the kinds of technologies that I think we find deeply problematic in society. But when we take a step back and look at what is actually happening on the ground with robots, we see something really different that I think we could design for in a way that would potentially alleviate many of these issues. So when we think about robots or artificial intelligence in space, we often think about some significant science fiction touchstones that tell us a couple of characteristics that these robots and agents have. First, they're entirely independent and autonomous. I mean, I think R2-D2 gets plugged in once for a few minutes at in one of the Star Wars movies, but essentially they walk around, they talk, they do everything independent of humans. They don't need any humans. They're perfectly fine by themselves. Secondly, that they are built to be so perfect that they can replace human intelligences. And in fact, the thing that we might want to do with artificial intelligence is to make it so human-like it's even more human than human and ultimately surpasses us. Now, fortunately, we can build robots to look really cute and lovable, but at the same time, these robots are probably going to take over, especially because we imbue them with all of these all-knowing characteristics and all-seeing characteristics. And I would argue that many of these kinds of tropes from Western, European, and North American science fiction are fueling some investments in artificial intelligence that are moving us down some very deeply problematic paths. So I want to give us a bit of a reality check, because I want to surface some things that, as an ethnographer working with NASA's teams that actually work with robots in space, I've learned over the last several years. And these are all challenges to the dominant narrative of what it's like to live and work with AI in space. And here's a place where I think we could actually take some inspiration from what this work is actually like. So first of all, there is no autonomy. None of these robots work autonomously. They are all commanded and controlled, like down to the microsecond, by a large heterogeneous team of scientists and engineers on Earth, whose job it is to take care of their every movement, their every moment, and to shepherd them through that work on another planet. So despite the fact that the artificial intelligence on board is improving, they're getting better at driving around things without falling over or driving off a cliff, they're extremely limited in what they can do. And what this means is that instead of seeking full autonomy, these systems integrate very large distributed teams of humans with very meaningful work with these robots. And so here I want to make a big distinction between what we're currently seeing in artificial intelligence. People like Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri have talked about the extraordinary amounts of ghost work, of the kind of extracting away from AI. So it looks like your Alexa's just doing everything by itself, and you don't know that you're piping in people from the Philippines to interpret what you're saying to your device. What I want to say here is that the people, the large team of people, are actually front and center and part of the investigation, and they're doing meaningful work, and they're doing meaningful work together. It's not a one-on-one relationship. It's a many-to-one relationship as they work with these robots. Additionally, they are not interested in having robots that are human-like, because humans suck at space. If you put humans in space, they don't do very well unless they have a lot of support that I'm going to get to. So instead, what they do is they send robots that have different senses than us, that think differently than us, and they create these synergistic human-robot teams in which the robots do things robots are good at, and the people do things people are good at, and they don't try to do each other's jobs. Instead, they work together and they create this really interesting kind of synergy. I'm showing you some pictures here taken by the Spirit robot. This is of Mars, at the surface of Mars, and these images were essential for making a discovery of a site of past water, a hydrothermal hot spring on Mars. But no human could have seen this with their eyes, because human eyes, when they get to Mars, just see a lot of dusty, rusty red. What you needed were the robotic eyes that had multiple different filters. What you needed were computers on Earth that could put those filters of the cameras together and show you things that your eyes could not see, to the point where scientists would say to me, if I had to go to Mars, I wouldn't want my eyes. I would want this camera. I would want the pan cam. I want the rover. Yes, it's frustrating that it takes it a long time to do things, but its senses are built for this environment in a way that mine are not. And so this I think this makes for much more interesting human robot systems than trying to build intelligences that in a sort of Kurzweilian fashion are going to surpass us and take over the world. It also means that they enter into these really interesting collaborative partnerships that are not codependent. So it's not one of those situations where the robot is taking advantage of all the human labor, or the human is taking advantage of all the robot labor, or there's some misunderstanding between the two. In fact, these partnerships work because they're conceived of as partnerships, and because there's space for each intelligence to do what it does best. I'll also say that this requires a tremendous amount of care. It requires care in both directions. First of all, when humans do go into space, because humans are bad at being in space, the entirety of the ecosystems built around them and all the artificial intelligence systems are there to help keep them alive. Similarly, when we send robots into space, we spend considerable amounts of energy and time making sure that they stay alive. And I will say the kinds of emotional connections that I've witnessed between the people on Earth and the robots exploring Mars or exploring Saturn is deep and profound. And it's a sense of collective solidarity and community with the scientists on Earth, but it's also a sensibility of care towards the robots with which they are engaged. And this is a very different sensibility, the sense of care, repair, maintenance, and sensibility towards the robot, and also the robots or the system sensibility towards the human, than what we're currently developing in many of our systems. And it also means that we do things like, on Earth, we build for constant upgrades and for planned obsolescence. These are people who are building their robots to last 30, 40, 50, or 60 years. The image I have here is of the New Horizons spacecraft that flew past Pluto. It launched something like 14 years before it got there. But what was so fascinating was that at one point when they launched, they went out and they bought every computer on eBay they could find that was built in 1997. Because if something happened to one of their ground systems, they would need to swap in something that could talk to a spacecraft that was launched in like 1997. So you're always working with things that have the brains of your wristwatch from the 80s. You're not working with the latest and greatest in something super shiny. But what this does mean is that you enter into a relation of care with these robots and with these artificial agents that are exploring the solar system along with you. And these are some principles that I feel like if we were to center these realities of what it's like to live and work alongside artificially intelligent agents in space, we might be more likely to build more sensitive, thoughtful, reciprocal, interactive, and just more interesting kinds of systems on Earth than following the kind of blatant path that's laid down for us in this kind of science fiction. Now, I do want to note that, I've tried to show that there are ways in which this could be inspiring for us, but of course, these systems are not perfect, right? So these individuals who work with these missions are very much inspired by science fiction traditions. They're very inspired by this view of sort of everyone working together in a kind of racially harmonious and internationally harmonious way in space. So they really would like to embody the characteristics of things like Star Trek, but of course, we're still looking at a population that's working very hard to diversify. They are reading a lot of science fiction, but the science fiction they're reading is coming from a very white Western tradition. So they're reading more of this than they are necessarily of this. Although I will say that increasingly, science fiction writers from the feminist tradition, such as Ursula Le Guin, are becoming much more part of the everyday conversations of many of the younger members of the field. And this is a community that really cares deeply about trying to get away from some of the images and sensibilities towards colonialism, and yet, of course, is still living with the legacy and grappling with the fact that they are working with NASA, and a lot of this is about flag planting. So there's a real sensibility towards that among the scientists and engineers that I've worked with and that I study, that these are the kinds of things that they're actively grappling with. So to sum up, a lot of the current, especially in the commercial spaceflight sector, which is starting to take over the public imagination, is also building on these very science fiction sensibilities, these gleaming capsules, gleaming white capsules and touch screens, etc., where the spaces that we're going to inhabit in space appear to be seamless, perfected, beautiful, and all of those entanglements are abstracted away. But I think those entanglements are part of what make us human, and it's part of what makes working with artificial intelligence so potentially so interesting. And to get rid of that is what's going to make working with artificial intelligence so deeply problematic. So my interest would be in saying that I think we could embrace these kinds of entangled and messy kinds of complicated relations in the building of some fascinating kinds of artificially intelligent systems. But to shy away from that is to only reproduce some of the problems that we've already seen in the literature so far. So thank you for your attention. I'm really looking forward to Kim's comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janet Vertesi, for this terrific contributions. I have a lot of notes. And I look forward to Dr. Mckinson's contribution. Over to you.
Perfect. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Why is it not giving me? Okay. Okay. So as a way to, bring you into my first provocation, I'm going to offer two provocations today. I'd like to ask you to think about what you were doing on Saturday, May 30, 2020. Now, let me jog your memory a little bit. George Floyd was killed 5 days earlier, and there were protests in cities all across America, right? From Minneapolis, Chicago, Denver, DC. So on the afternoon of May 30, 2020, I was actually watching, CNN. I was watching Brian Stevenson being interviewed by CNN's Fareed Zakaria about the George Floyd killing and the protests. And then Zakaria, in a moment of almost childlike excitement, cut off Stevenson, who was speaking at the time. And the screen cut immediately to Florida, to Cape Canaveral, Florida. Because you see, not only was May 30 a day of protest against anti-Black racism in the US, it was also the day of the launch of the SpaceX Crew Dragon from Cape Canaveral. And this was a historic launch. I'm sure many of you recall it, because this was the first spacecraft to launch from the US soil in nearly a decade. So I watched the launch, but I was left with this deeply unsettling feeling, right? And I kept on asking myself, why do I feel this way, especially given my own space fascination? Given the fact that, I love watching space events on TV. I had ambitions to be an astronaut when I was a young girl in Jamaica. And I realized that it was the way in which the media was portraying both these events, the George Floyd protests and the launch from Cape Canaveral, as separate, as disconnected. And these, events were not only being portrayed as disconnected, but space travel, as embodied in this launch, was being portrayed as neutral and really disconnected from what was happening on Earth. But what I realized was that for me, as a Black woman, as somebody who was born and raised in the post-colonial Caribbean, that these two events were intimately tethered. Now, since that May afternoon, we've only seen an increase in the excitement around what's being called and heralded as the new space race. We know Elon Musk has been very vocal about his plans to colonize Mars. He hopes to have humans there by 2026. Just last month, SpaceX launched the Inspiration 4 crew, which was the first all-civilian crew to enter outer space. The seats on that mission were actually chartered by the billionaire Jared Isaacman. Just this past July, Richard Branson, who has a net worth of $4.4 billion, made a suborbital trip to space via his company Virgin Galactic. And only a few days later, Jeff Bezos, and we know that Bezos and Musk jockey for who is the richest man on the planet. But a few days after Branson, Bezos made his own suborbital trip as well via his company Blue Origin. So this is the new space race, right? A playground where Earth's richest humans, right, mostly white men from the West, and their private corporations wield immense power in essentially determining a global space agenda and are urgently mobilizing colossal fortunes in the name of the ultimate colonization of outer space. And I hope that in our conversation, we'll come back to Jeff Bezos's cowboy hat and boots, which he wore to outer space as well, because that says something in and of itself. Now, unquestionably, there's a certain amount of eco-anxiety, right, that undergirds today's space race. Billionaires like us, the planet's less well off, we're being forced to contend with an Earth and a reality, a not so distant reality, when Earth is made inhospitable to human life due to a series of man-made and environmental crises. So the narrative is this: to save ourselves, we must colonize outer space, and it is these white billionaires who will, in a grand humanitarian fashion, be our saviors. But as we know, Earth has much to teach us about the history of human colonization in the hands of powerful white men. Unbridled conquest has historically led to the dispossession of indigenous lands and the disenfranchisement of indigenous peoples and peoples of color on Earth. So what we know is that billionaire space colonization, left unchecked and pursued in a manner that ignores the mistakes of the past, runs the risk of repeating some of Earth's most tragic histories in outer space. So the first provocation that I'd offer to you is this: how should Americans understand billionaire space colonization in the context of racialized histories of colonization on Earth, and especially in a world now indelibly changed by the killing of George Floyd? And will the future era of space colonization be one that is just and whole for all? Now, as you meditate on that first provocation, I want you to think about the contrast that I opened with. George Floyd protests alongside the SpaceX launch in 2020. And I want to offer you another contrast of images as well too. So on the left, we see an image of Vice President Agnew and former President Lyndon Johnson watching the liftoff of Apollo 11, which of course was a space flight that first landed humans on the moon. And on the right, we have an image of the Reverend Ralph Abernathy from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a civil rights group, in a moment of protest against the Apollo 11 launch. And I want to encourage you all, maybe after this event, to go and take a listen to Gil Scott-Heron's Whitey on the Moon, a dub poem, which really, gets at this issue that I'm trying to, have us focus on by putting these two images side by side. So as we know, we think about colonization and the ways in which space exploration has long been tied to white men and their desires to design the unreal estate of the future, which is how Mark Derry has described it. I hope that we can have a larger conversation about semantics as well, right? The intentions and implications behind the word colonization, right? As it's almost being used cavalierly. Should we be using another word? Is this just a case of, the language over policing by even problematizing the word colonization? And I hope too that we can have a deeper conversation about colonization as a longue durée, right? That includes overlapping spatiotemporalities of slavery, imperialism, colonialism, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, white supremacy. Because of course, we also have to pay attention to the present day histories of these private space corporations, right? Perhaps the imperial actions of these corporations as well, the relationships between these corporations and their workers as well. I'm thinking about an article that just came out this week talking about an authoritarian bro culture at Blue Origin, and I believe this was published in the Post. So this is my first provocation. Now, if this first provocation is asking you to think deeply on the intentions and implications of space colonization in relation to the multiple spatiotemporalities of earthly colonization, then for the second provocation, I really want us to think more deeply about the question of sovereignty in outer space. Let's think on this through Elon Musk's Starlink project. So Starlink is, in a sense, an internet satellite project from SpaceX, and the whole goal of Starlink is to provide high-speed internet to people in remote locations. But as Musk has articulated, the ultimate goal of Starlink is to facilitate communication between Earth and Mars once SpaceX has set up human colonies on Mars. Now, clause 10 of Starlink's customer pre-order agreement is particularly interesting, right? And it reads, for services provided to, on, or in orbit around the planet Earth or the moon, this agreement and any disputes between us arising out of or related to this agreement, including disputes regarding arbitrability, will be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of California in the United States. Now, here comes an interesting bit. For services provided on Mars or in transit to Mars via Starship or other spacecraft, the parties recognize Mars as, and the parties being the customer and SpaceX, recognize Mars as a free planet, and that no Earth-based government has authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. Accordingly, disputes will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of Martian settlement. Now, you can just imagine the reaction to clause number 10 in the customer pre-order agreement. The clause, of course, raises pressing questions about how Earth's billionaires will negotiate issues of power, sovereignty, and the governance of celestial bodies in outer space, right? The 1967 Outer Space Treaty establishes that no nation can claim sovereignty of outer space or any celestial body, but clause number 10 really gives us a glimpse of perhaps legal and political disputes that lie on the horizon. And for me, an anthropologist, this clause really forces us to contend with what Frank Billet calls cartographic anxieties, right? Space, outer space is amorphous, voluminous, disembodied, abstract, and so it raises these questions about how we will confront what it means to map and control more than human geographies. And what clause number 10, I would argue, shows us too, is that this Westphalian concept of sovereignty as government as absolute, and this idea of sovereign power as being tied to a kind of sedentarist metaphysics, to draw on the language of the anthropologist Lisa Malky, this idea of ethnic belonging to territorially bounded nation states. If we move into space with this notion of sovereignty, we're going to run into problems. And what scholars have argued is that sovereignty is, of course, not a neutral category. And I'm thinking here about Yarimar Bonilla, who has argued this, and she draws on the writings of the Martinican poet and philosopher Edward Glissant. And he suggests that not only is sovereignty not a neutral category of analysis, but it's a native category of the West. And we have to hear Glissant suggest we have to think about the West, not just as a place, but as a project. So, as we think about the politics of effecting control in a more than human geography, outer space, this is my second provocation to you all. What alternate and more capacious imaginings of sovereignty must billionaire space enthusiasts be bold enough to incorporate into their political and technocratic plans in order to ensure the ethical and sustainable colonization of outer space? And just to wrap up, I'll include here, two photos to show you how it is that I've been grappling with this question, actually by turning to the history of Jamaica's Maroon communities. Now, I want to urge us to think about the Maroons as more than just runaway slaves, but as freedom seekers who established free and fortified strongholds in Jamaica's mountainous regions from as early as the 17th century. And what I argue is that Maroon communities represent some of the earliest Afrofuturistic projects in the Americas, because their leaders really dared to imagine a modern world in which Black bodies were free and whole. On the left, I have an image of Nanny of the Maroons, who was a leader of the Windward Maroons in Jamaica, in the eastern part of the country. And on the right, I have an image there of Chief Richard Curry, who was just recently elected chief of the Accompong Maroons in Jamaica. And what's interesting about Curry is that he's obviously drawing on the legacy, the historical legacy of Nanny, and he has been very vocal about reasserting Maroon sovereignty in Jamaica, especially as this sovereignty continues to be threatened by US mining corporations, by the Jamaican police, by the Jamaican government, which has to this day not ratified the 1738 treaty between the Maroons and the British. right? And to use Curry's words, you know, he, as he talks about sovereignty, he has said that the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, and maroon sovereignty is derived from the freedom of our lands. So to end, you know, I want to say that as we think about colonization histories on Earth and plans for the colonization of outer space, as we think about George Floyd in relation to Ralph Abernathy protesting Apollo 11, as we think about what maroons can teach us about Mars, I want to leave you with this Afrofuturistic painting by the artist Peter Williams, which I love so much. It's titled, "He Was a Global Traveler." And I want us to use this painting as a way to meditate on how it is that maybe Afrofuturistic philosophies rooted in liberation, freedom, emancipation can get us to start having the conversations that we need to be having now about ethical human civilization in outer space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mckinson. I very, very much appreciate your wonderful contribution. I am just going to remind everybody that you can put questions into the chat, and I'm a little mindful of time. And so I'm just going to ask one question to you both, and then I want to invite you to engage with one another's provocations and presentations, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. And so I'm just going to ask a question with a policy hat on. You both have given incredibly rich accounts of kind of realities and narratives around space and space exploration that are extremely important. And when we look at kind of the policy landscape around artificial intelligence, and when we look specifically at something that is not even necessarily policy, but that is kind of decides where money goes, which is national artificial intelligence strategies, which currently outline where and how funding that is mobilized through these powerful narratives of artificial intelligence goes. Those build often on those tropes, Jenna, that you presented, and those colonialist kind of logics that you spoke about, Kimberly. So I wonder, what would be kind of a cue you would give policymakers based on your own work, but also based on each other's contributions that you heard tonight, to kind of challenge that a little bit and crack it open, as it were. And whoever wants to kind of take that one first.
Yeah, I'll go first. So, you know, that's a great question, because I think, you know, this is a larger question about how it is that these larger philosophical questions, these larger questions that, you know, we're asking through, you know, ethnography, you know, and, you know, Janet, you know, really gave us a sense of the wonderful ethnographic work that she's doing. How is it that we can scale upwards, right? Because at the end of the day, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are not going to, you know, go to an academic journal article. They're going to be thinking about larger policy implications and how to impact their corporations and their profit lines as well too, right? You know, if I were to have, you know, initiate a conversation, you know, in this regard, you know, I think very oftentimes, you know, we come to this conversation of, you know, space colonization, and, you know, a lot of folks will say, you know, for example, well, we haven't even found any sentient beings in outer space, right? And so, you know, we're not going to, we have no intentions to behave in any atrocious manner or whatnot. But, you know, I think what we have to recognize is that whether we want to admit it or not, these pioneers, right? These billionaires are essentially pioneers, right? And we're almost at, I like to think of us at the beginning of an era, right, of space colonization. Now, whether or not we end up, you know, colonizing Mars in our lifetime, or even finding, you know, other species, is beyond the point for me, right? You know, that's like a minor thing for me at this point in time, right? But I think it's a larger ethical, you know, responsibility that these pioneers have, right, to actually lay the groundwork, lay the rules, and be very deliberate about their language, right, about how it is that they intend to ethically and sustainably engage outer space. Not simply for us, right? Because I think this is where oftentimes we get stuck, right? As if we want this articulated for us and for our generation, right? This is a question about how we articulate it at the beginning of this era for the human beings who will be colonizing outer space and living in these colonies in 100 years, in 1,000 years, long after, our time on Earth has, expired, right? So again, as we think about colonization in terms of this long journey, I think we have to be thinking about policy and the intention and the implications of policy with a view towards not just the immediate future, but also the long journey as we think about the future as well too, and the ways in which, what we lay down now, right, in the same way that a footprint on the moon will be there for all eternity or whatever, right? What we lay down now, right, is going to lay the groundwork for how it is that human beings in 100 years, in 1,000 years, are actually going to be, carrying out these kinds of projects in outer space as well.
It's such a great provocation. I could listen to Dr. Mckinson all night. Also, I think the difficult thing with national AI strategies is that they are imbued in so many other kinds of politics. So on the one hand, there was a military and transnational issue here, which is largely about the rise of China compared to the United States, and a kind of AI race that's associated with seeing what international players are doing. But then there's also this kind of the politicking, the micro-politicking of where the money goes here, to which research groups, to which startups, to which like associations and groups. And here, one of the most difficult thing that I encounter when I hear talk of AI is that people seem to forget that AI is speculative venture, right? It's an opportunity for venture capital, and it's an opportunity for speculation. And to some extent, those bold visions of these kinds of techno futures are there to fuel a form of speculation that enables capital to flow. The difficulty I have with those visions is that capital is it's extractive, it's racialized, it devalues labor. It sets aside entire swaths of populations as not that are contributing to the production of this beautiful vision, and devalues them. And it also monetizes personal data through the kind of machine learning techniques that are necessary in order to get artificial intelligences to do things at all. And so to a large extent, when I say, look, we need to shift the paradigm away from sort of human replacement towards these more like interactive, distinctive forms of intelligences, like thinking about other forms of partnerships. And thinking about partnerships can get us into some more, I think, generative terrain, but needs to move us away from the extractiveness of working off human data, vast swaths of racialized and devalued labor, and in order to fuel the continuing aspirations of venture capital dominated firms. I mean, I think we've seen in the history of technology that these kinds of big national initiatives are really responsible for seeding and for enabling quote unquote innovation in these centers like Silicon Valley that enable these companies that become behemoths to really get on their feet, right? And that's a fear that I have that I think needs to be addressed in a policy domain. But at the same time, I recognize that that policy domain is dominated by some very different concerns than mine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mckinson and Dr. Vertesi, for this terrific answers to that question. I just want to remind our attendees you can put questions into the Q&A chat. Now we're going to be starting to collect those. And so I just want to invite both of you to perhaps ask a question that you have for one another, or maybe a comment. I have another question, but I want to step back a little as a moderator and invite you in to respond to one another. And maybe Dr. Mckinson, if you want to kind of go first.
Yeah, I think that Janet's work is just, really so interesting and so exciting. And the mere fact that she's like mobilizing ethnography as a powerful way in which to study these questions is even more impressive to me. And, I think, what her work points to is the fact that oftentimes when we, I think about like the billionaire space race, we kind of have these images of Jeff Bezos in his cowboy hat and boots, you know, going into outer space and planting the flag. But of course, the reality is as Janet is pointing us to, is that robots are going to be right there alongside us. In fact, they're going to be there before us, right? They're going to be the ones setting up the colonies. They're going to be the one that's like laying the groundwork. So I was just wondering if, you know, Janet could like, and I think that we could have like a whole other conversation about this, right? About like AI and consciousness, and, you know, as we think about the design of, you know, AI, how it is that we actually account for these larger issues around, you know, colonialism and disenfranchisement and dispossession, right? And what this could mean in outer space. So I don't know if this is something that, you know, you could like speak on, Janet, because it's one thing to code in the basic sense a machine to be ethical, right? But this is perhaps also a larger conversation about what it means for, you know, AI technology to possess a consciousness that would allow them to even do this kind of ethical work, which is what we would be essentially asking them to do in outer space.
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you. And I totally noticed the cowboy boots as well. There's a long history of cowboy boots in space. And I think it's worth noting that, you know, places like SpaceX and Blue Origin are really reliant on national government contracts to a large extent. Like, they are, one of their primary purchasers is NASA, right, for launching those kinds of vehicles. So the notion that private space or commercial space is happening entirely outside of NASA or is in competition to NASA is I think false. Again, about the colonialism and dispossession question, I would say that, you know, I don't actually think that there's a future where machines have ethics or we can program them to have ethics. And in fact, I think that's the thing that I mean by saying, don't make machines be people. It's more interesting if you make machines be other kinds of companions, but make the humans do some of the things that humans do really well. Some of that is decision making, some of that is ethics, some of that is feeling, some of that is interaction. But there's things that humans can bring to the table and should do. So when I think about, you know, like machines setting up colonies on Mars, I don't see them acting independently or autonomously, but actually as embedded in human teams on Earth. And even the stories of, you know, working with astronauts on the moon or whatever are populated. It's all like, you know, 5,000 people in a mission control center at home on Earth, like watching and managing their every move. So to that extent, I think actually it comes down to the people and the kinds of narratives we're going to bring with us and the kinds of practices we're going to bring with us. And here I am actually hopeful, particularly if we keep humans in the loop. What I have seen in the last 5 years in my ethnographies with NASA teams is a real turn towards thinking about restorative justice, towards thinking about decolonialization, towards really confronting the problems and the considerable problems with the weighty history that they carry with them. And to try to, you know, at one point, a scientist was like, do you know any post-colonial historians we can speak to? Because I want to be sure that we get this right. You know, they really are trying very hard to shift some of the ways that they're approaching this problem of exploration as one that's not exploitative, particularly if they assume that they may encounter life elsewhere in the solar system. This is a tricky conversation, but they are sort of self-educating, reading a lot of literature from anthropology and sociology, also engaging more with indigenous knowledge communities and trying to understand that more as a different form of knowledge in the world that they might incorporate. So again, I don't want to say that like science is fixed and the problems are solved, but I do want to say that when you sit with the mess of the people on the ground are bringing a very broad toolkit to these exploration ventures. And the more we allow that to happen, I think the more we'll see innovations and changes potentially in the way that we look to questions of things like colonization as decolonized. But that's me being like super optimistic. I guess one question I had for you, actually, Dr. Mckinson, was I was really struck by how you opened with that juxtaposition between the Black Lives Matter protests and that first launch of the Dragon capsule, and particularly seeing those two white men who were sent up as the pilots, as experimental test pilots, all I could hear in my head all day was Whitey's on the moon, Whitey's on the moon, and like, how is it that this is happening, yet again? And your first provocation made me think about all of these different entanglements about racialization as well as exploration. And I wonder to what extent, certainly because we're dealing with these billionaires, that forms of racialized capitalism and global labor chains, right, are also contributing to the kinds of inordinate amounts of wealth that enable this kind of exploration. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to whether or how that form of racialization is playing into your thinking or not, and if you could maybe just extrapolate a little bit on that, especially thinking about like the origins of that form of capital, and not just where they hope to spend it by walking all over sovereignty.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, one of the things that I think I mentioned in the presentation was that, I think oftentimes when we hear space colonization and then folks say, okay, let's problematize colonization, we immediately go to these images of the past, right? Colonization, European colonization, in the Americas in the, 15th to like 18th centuries or so. And so what I encourage, folks to do is to really think about, as I said, the laundry, right? And the ways in which, Akil Mbembe talks about, post-colonial experience as being, defined by these overlapping overlapping temporalities, these entanglements, right? And so, that's the lens that I bring to thinking about, racialized capital, for example, and the connections between the Caribbean really being, the center of, the plantation economy and giving, and, really being central to the making of the modern world as we know it, right? And the ties between racialized capital in that moment in time, right? And the ties between racialized capital to the Black body historically, right? And I don't see it as disconnected from some of the conversations that we're having now around these corporations, right? And the ways in which these billionaires have come into their billions, right? That they can now mobilize in the name of colonization of outer space, right? So, for example, what does it mean for Jeff Bezos to, be positioned as this, visionary, right? And as this, this guy who is essentially going to take us to the next frontier, but also to have a company that crushes unions, right? And that being, Amazon, right? What does it mean, again, to reference this Washington Post article for Jeff Bezos to, have a company, and this is Blue Origin, where, employees are coming out and saying that there's an authoritarian, toxic culture there, right? What does it mean for, Elon Musk in 2020 to come out and to say that his employees will, get Juneteenth as a holiday, but you'll have to use one of your paid vacations, right? And then he backtracked after he got caught some flack for it. And of course, the Musks, the Bezoses, the Bransons, these are men from imperial nations, right? Nations that have their own imperial, in the case of, England and the United States have their own imperial and colonial histories. In the case of South Africa, which is where Musk is from, that has its own interest in, racialized history as well. So, and I don't think that we can just see these men and their corporations as just operating in these vacuums, right? And what they're doing or intending to do in outer space as separate from their other corporations on Earth. So I think that we're at a point now, and what this larger conversation about space colonization is forcing us towards is, I think, an even more capacious understanding of what we mean when we say colonization. And some folks will say, well, we should be using another word. I think before we even get to that point, for me, I think it's not as simple as saying another word, because another word will also have, perhaps similar histories as well. Say we don't use colonization, but we use settlements, right? That brings a whole host of other histories as well. I think the larger issue is to interrogate truthfully the deeper histories and power dynamics behind a word like colonization, because it's pointless if we just change the language without essentially changing the philosophies undergirding what it is that we intend to do.
Thank you so much both for engaging so fruitfully with one another's provocations. I want to shift gears a little bit and bring in the audience. And we have 3 questions. And in the interest of time, I'm going to allocate questions, and I'm going to ask you to kindly keep answers to maybe 1 to 2 minutes. And I'm just going to start with a question from Nat Whelan and Dr. Vertesi. I think this is for you. Is part of approaching AI ethically going to require paying people for participating in data collection for machine learning? How does it relate to the automation of labor and resulting job loss? Great question.
Well, you're asking someone who's a conscientious objector to the personal data economy and who's been off Google systems for 10 years. So my answer would be like, we should not be collecting data from people for machine learning. And I think it's time to move away from that as a process moving forward. I have a lot to say about automation of labor and job losses. I have a lot to say about how companies in particular set up opportunities for human labor that they expect to automate away. And in order to, again, acquire venture capital and really to build towards monopoly. So what I would say is this isn't about technical details like data collection or even about who's paid what for what kind of labor, but how do we confront monopolization efforts? How do we confront the undergirding questions of whether such a path is valuable in the first place? And I would refer you to a paper that I published in Sociologica about not quite a year ago, called Pre-Automation, which examines some of these questions in detail.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vertesi, for that answer. And Dr. Mckinson, the next one I'm going to toss over to you from Dr. Jesus. What ethical obligations do engineers working on AI in the space industry have? What can we as cogs in the machine and giant corporations do to urge the billionaire space cowboys at the top to make space exploration more egalitarian?
Great question. I think one of the things is that oftentimes we think about science as just, neutral and, removed from some of these larger questions about the politics of race. And I think we start there, right? And recognizing that, even engineers, working at, SpaceX or Blue Origin or NASA have an ethical obligation, right? But I think even, beyond that as well too, if you pay attention to, these larger conversations or the critiques around space colonization, a lot of it is coming from academics, journalists. And I think it's imperative that these debates and conversations be had within these corporations, right? And it's not just so that we just don't have this image of the engineer just going along with whatever, with this, technocratic plan. And, this is also, I think, a bigger question too about diversifying the space industry as well too. And, the images that Janet showed us pointed us to that as well too, right? So if you're not having, a diverse group of folks at the table, right, and ensuring that, folks have, an equal say at the table, right? Because it's one thing to bring folks to the table, but if they're mute, then it's pointless, right? Then this is going to, I think, push the conversation within the industry as well, and push it to a place that it actually needs to go to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mckinson. And last question for both of you, with a request to keep it super short, from Mary Louise Pratt, who is asking, does the term empire and imperialism have relevance here? Are these billionaires better thought of as empire builders rather than colonialists or colonizers? Dr. Vertesi.
So I actually love this exploration of alternative vocabulary because it all comes down to the same kinds of problematic ventures. And I'm really interested in calling a spade and not trying to come up with some kind of neutral thing that we're doing in space that's different than what we've done before, because I think many of these organizations are bringing that history with them. And I love the challenge of what it would mean every time we saw a headline or something about space colonization to say space imperialism. I think that would really get the conversation going, probably in the direction I'd prefer.
Yeah, this is another great question again, and I'd say to log back to Mary Louise. Okay, but like, where does empire begin and colonialism end? And so we know that empire has always been tied to these power dynamics as well too, even in the least traumatic of cases, right? And so again, I think there is a question about language here that I think we the public, the space industry will have to, confront. Jesse Singal, who is a journalist, he has suggested that, the word, colonialism, or people making a fuss over the word colonialism, is just a matter of language over policing, right? But there are people who have, deep issues with it. So again, I think that this is a political question, right, about how we approach these issues, but I think we're also going to realize that it's also this a linguistic issue as well, trying to take language very seriously. Jamaicans have a saying that words sound power, right? And so we know that language, right, resonates deeply and has consequences as well, and language is not neutral at all. So I don't think it's a matter of just like shifting cards and let's just choose like that. I think it's about more deeply, interrogating what we mean when we actually say particular words.
Thank you so much, and I think that is a great kind of note to end on. We are at time. Thank you so much, Dr. Janet Vertesi and Dr. Kimberly Mckinson. Dr. Vertesi at Princeton, Dr. Mckinson at CUNY. Dr. Vertesi has a book out, Shaping Science 2020, with it is Chicago Press, yes, that you can buy. Dr. Mckinson is working on a book. She also has 2 really terrific articles out on Sapiens that I highly recommend, sapiens.org. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight, for your commentary. It is much appreciated. Thank you, attendees, for joining us again for Co-opting AI in the fall of 2021. We are going to proceed with the series very soon, namely on October 25th, 6 to 7 p.m. with Co-opting AI Religion. And with that, huge thanks to everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Stay healthy. Take some joy in life as we now can be out again. And thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Janet and Kim. Much appreciated. And thank you, team. Sam and Zari. Wonderful as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mona. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks. That was really fun. Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care.